In this video, we will talk about the relationship between dyslexia and language and try to clarify it. Let us start with what dyslexia is. Dyslexia is defined as a persistent and unexpected difficulty in developing age-appropriate and experience-appropriate word reading skills. So dyslexia does not concern primary problems with reading comprehension. It's not dyslexia when your problem is not understanding, in other words. However, it is quite possible to have low performance on reading comprehension tests because of dyslexia if your word reading problems hinder your understanding. In this case, the apparent comprehension difficulties are secondary to the dyslexia. So it doesn't concern a comprehension problem per se, but low comprehension performance due to the word reading problems. If someone does have actual problems with comprehension per se, these problems are likely to be present both in reading and oral language comprehension. So reading comprehension and oral language comprehension kind of go together, indicating problems with comprehension per se. That would be text level problems. And of course, since these are two different kinds and partially independent types of problems, it is possible to have both of them at the same time to varying degrees. But dyslexia itself is specific to word level reading skills. So it's not a language problem in the sense that comprehension problems are, but it is related to language because much of what is closely associated with literacy development depends on language. For example, you cannot develop reading skill if you don't have phonological awareness. And you cannot have phonological awareness if your actual phonological knowledge and skill hasn't developed properly. So language development is a prerequisite to those metalinguistic and other skills that lead to reading development. In addition, general language development, as measured by tests of grammar, vocabulary, and other similar things, is very closely related to early reading development because in the beginning, everything is strongly associated. In the early stages of learning to read, both print-dependent skills and print-independent skills are strongly connected to language development and predicted by measures such as vocabulary. This situation clears up later after that basic reading skills have been developed and decoding success has reached a high level. So dyslexia and language are intimately related, although dyslexia is not a problem with language in general. We can still say that dyslexia is a kind of a language problem because it relates to parts of language. But it doesn't mean that if you have dyslexia, you have language problems. Let's go a little bit into what the differences are. So the so-called dyslexic profile, things that we expect to function adequately versus not adequately when someone has word level reading problems, when someone has dyslexia. What are the domains in which we do not see consistent or clinically significant impairment? These domains include general language development, including grammar and speech and knowledge of words, vocabulary. So these aren't typically impaired in dyslexia. But it is true that we can see difficulties in these domains among children with dyslexia more often than in children who learn to read without difficulty. So there are more frequent problems. There are also group differences. So the average performance of a group with dyslexia may be a bit lower than the average performance of a group without dyslexia in some of these measures some of the time. These aren't very reliably replicable results, but they do occur more often than chance. And so this has been called as a subtle impairment in language. Subtle means that it is small, not easy to see. That's why I'm saying here it's not clinically significant. It's not that the children are language impaired. And you don't see it in every child or even in every study or even in every group. But it does occur more frequently than chance. So something is going on. We don't see consistent or clinically significant impairments in tests of spoken language comprehension, otherwise known as oral comprehension or listening comprehension. These are all the same thing. So children with dyslexia do not have difficulties with spoken language comprehension. Although, again, sometimes you may find on average lower performance for a group, or individual children may have some small difficulty more often than you would expect in the general population, which is usually not enough to justify a clinical diagnosis. In the same domain, we see short-term memory. So there are no consistent or clinically significant impairments in tests of short-term memory. However, we do see consistent difficulties as the memory tasks become more demanding of verbal working memory. And a particularly interesting example is the very frequently used digit span task. So usually, if you test a group of children with dyslexia against a matched group of children without dyslexia, you will see differences in their performance on the digit span task. But if we analyze this digit span task, we see that most or indeed all of the difference is coming from the backward span part of it. So the second part of the task. In the first part of the task, where children just have to repeat a sequence of digits, it is not surprising to find no difference between these two groups. So the differences become apparent when the test becomes more demanding in terms of requiring the manipulation of the memory content, of the verbal memory content before reporting back. So again, there are indications of a subtle deficit of some sort of difference, which is neither consistent nor clinically significant. In comparison to these domains, there are other domains in which we see consistent and clinically significant impairment. So you would call the performance impaired on tests like phonological awareness. Indeed, this is the most obvious and most predictive task of reading that is not reading itself, especially in the early stages of learning to read, but frequently extending into later development through the early grades. Of course, not for every child. There is heterogeneity, but this is very frequently seen and can be clinically significant impairment, especially at the phonemic level. So when it concerns manipulation of individual phonemes rather than syllables. Also, we see consistent and clinically significant impairment in a majority of children with dyslexia for other metalinguistic tasks. And the crucial thing here is that these are all metalinguistic. So phonological awareness is a group of metalinguistic tasks in which children are supposed to turn their attention to the parts of words as objects. They need to be thinking about words and not about what the words mean. They need to be thinking about the sounds of words. This is a non-communicative engagement with words. It's wordplay. We're not using words to say something to someone. We are turning our attention onto words to identify their parts, parts that are phonemes and have no meaning in themselves. And then we can compare words as if they're objects. We can say if two words start or end with the same sound. We can take out one sound from one word, put it into another word, or pronounce the first word without it. These are meta-linguistic skills that we need in order to perform this task. And other kinds of meta-linguistic tasks include morphological awareness, where one turns their attention to the morphemes, the parts of words that bear meaning, and their relationships, and how different kinds of word parts convey different kinds of meanings. Again, in a kind of wordplay that can also be performed with pseudo words or novel words, where meaning is not influencing performance. Other metalinguistic tasks involve stress awareness, when, for example, you have to judge which of the syllables of a word bears the stress. In English, this is not so obvious because although there are stress differences, they're accompanied by vowel differences. If we say research or research, the vowel after the initial R is not the same in the two words. But in other languages, it is possible to distinguish words by stress alone without changing vowel quality. So stress judgment here is a more clearly stress-specific task. And we do see impairments in this kind of metalinguistic task associated with dyslexia. But we don't see difficulty in using the corresponding information to communicate. So although children with dyslexia are likely to have difficulty with phonological awareness tasks, they don't have phonology problems. They can speak properly, and they can hear spoken words properly, understand, interpret them properly. They're using the phonological structure of their language fully and appropriately, both to produce and to perceive language. So there is no phonological problem, but there is phonological awareness problem. There is an issue related to language where the impairment is at the meta-linguistic level, is at the level of one's ability to look upon language elements as objects. And a final domain where we see consistent and sometimes clinically significant impairment concerns phonological working memory. The effects here are smaller and less frequent than with phonological awareness, but they're nevertheless robust, reliable, and replicable. And as we said before, this has to do with demanding memory tasks in which manipulation of the stored material is also required. So what is going on? There are some language domains in which we see impairments associated with dyslexia and other language domains in which we don't. And we need to distinguish between some different questions. One question may be, do many of those with dyslexia have weaknesses in language development? Notice we don't say most or all of them. We say some of them. And we say weaknesses. Weaknesses means that performance may be slightly less than expected or slightly less than average, but we're not saying impairment. We're not saying something that is of significance for performance or for other aspects of one's life. So do many of those with dyslexia have weaknesses in language development? Yes. That is true for more children with dyslexia than for children that have typical reading development. The next question is, do many of those with dyslexia fulfill the criteria for developmental language disorder? So do we see lots of children with dyslexia also being language impaired? No, we don't. Even if the proportion is a bit higher than for the rest of the population, this is not a very substantial proportion. So we cannot say that a child with dyslexia is expected to some extent to have developmental language disorder. children with dyslexia in general do not have diagnosable language problems, even if some of them have subtle weaknesses in their language. The third question is, do most of those children who have delayed language development become dyslexic? Is delayed language development predictive of dyslexia? And the answer is no. Delayed language development is weakly, very weakly predictive of language problems, but it's not really predictive of dyslexia. Dyslexia is predicted by specific elements of language development that are actually not the core of language function, but concern the transition to metalinguistic skill. So in general, we need to draw distinctions between different things so that we can both understand that dyslexia is a kind of a language problem concerning written language and is associated with language weaknesses in certain domains, which are true, and distinguish that from the idea that being dyslexic means being language impaired, which is not true. So one distinction is weakness versus impairment. Weakness means a bit less than expected or a bit lower than average. Impairment means within a clinically significant range of performance, so sufficiently low that it is a problem for the respective domain and whatever depends on it. We need to distinguish between average group differences versus individual skill. So if a large group of children with dyslexia has a lower average performance on a language test than a large group of children without dyslexia, and if that difference is reliable, so we believe that they have on average lower performance, that doesn't mean that in individual children with dyslexia in general have lower performance than other children, because there's going to be huge overlap between the two groups. And many children with dyslexia will have higher language performance than children without dyslexia. The fact that there is an average difference doesn't help you predict whether individual children with dyslexia will have any language problem, and indeed most won't. We also must distinguish between phonological skills and lexical and grammatical skills. So phonological skills are what is most predictive of reading development, whereas lexical and grammatical skills aren't predictive of development past the very beginner stages when everything is strongly correlated, because everything is developing at the time. And in this context, it's even more important to distinguish between linguistic versus metalinguistic skills. So dyslexia is reliably associated with metalinguistic skills, but not with linguistic skills. We also need to take into account the general context in which reading develops. So if we have family risk factors, if we know that there are reading problems in the family, this indicates a context of development in which we expect that it is more likely than otherwise that things might go wrong in terms of whatever depends on brain development for language and reading. What this means is that if there is family risk for any language-related difficulties, this is associated with other language-related difficulties because there is increasingly understood that all of these are related to a similar set of genetic and neural comorbidity factors. So if someone inherits a high risk for one kind of learning difficulty, they also inherit a high risk for a range of other potential problems, including other learning difficulties, because of the way that the genetic and neural development factors express themselves in the final developmental outcome. And that is why dyslexia and language problems, and for example, math learning problems and attention deficit problems, and even other conditions are comorbid more than it would be expected by chance. There are higher proportions of co-occurrence among these things. And researchers are increasingly finding that there are common patterns of inherited variability that include not only these kinds of difficulties, but also some other mental health issues that are all indicative of differences in brain development. So all in all, our understanding of comorbidity suggests that it is possible to have a higher incidence of problems both in reading and in something else, such as language or attention, not because one causes the other, or because one is part of the other, but because they can be traced to related sources in brain development and possibly in genetics. To make this short, dyslexia does not include language problems as a part of it, but dyslexia and language problems may co-occur a bit more often than chance because they may be traced to similar original sources. What are the practical implications of this relationship between dyslexia and language development? First of all, language is not relevant for a diagnosis of dyslexia. Whatever performance you see in language tests does not affect whether or not someone should be called dyslexic, because dyslexia concerns whether one has problems with reading at the word level, not the text level. If someone has difficulty there, if someone isn't responding to instruction as others in the same environment, and someone also can see and hear adequately, then this someone can be diagnosed with dyslexia regardless of other kinds of problems that may co-occur or not. However, because of the potential for co-occurrence and because of the possible implications for how one should approach intervention, it is often necessary to assess language, even in a dyslexia case, in order to see if there actually are language problems, in order to identify strong and weak areas. Are there strengths in language that one can use? For example, is there a strong vocabulary that can be used to train orthographic knowledge? Or are there also weaknesses in vocabulary? So we need a more holistic approach to learning words and not just their orthographic forms. Or perhaps even to direct additional intervention. If there are problems with language comprehension, we need to work with language in addition to working with reading if there are word level reading problems. So the fact that dyslexia and language development are related has both theoretical and practical implications, as long as we keep separate these two different domains of possible impairment and understand the consequences of this relationship.